General Hospital spoilers tease that the revelation of Dante Falconeri's long-kept secret, his paternity of Gio Palmieri, has detonated across Port Charles like a quiet explosion. The truth, once buried under decades of misdirection, has finally surfaced, and Gio is anything but forgiving. For years he believed he was just another troubled youth skating by on charm and rebellion, unaware that his very existence was the result of a web spun by two people he now can't look at without rage. Brooklyn Quartermain and Dante Falconeri, his mother and father, not only kept the truth from him but allowed him to grow up never knowing who he really was. And now that he does, the pain has turned into fury. Joe's resentment runs deep. It's not just the betrayal of withheld information, it's the sense of being robbed of identity, of agency, of family. He had grown up making sense of his world without a father, and suddenly he's told that Dante, a man he has crossed paths with more times than he can count, is his biological father. That Brooklyn, who always seemed protective in a complicated, distant way, is the one who gave birth to him. But they never told him. They let him stumble through confusion and anger for years. And now they want his understanding. Dante, torn between duty and desperation, is doing everything he can to build a bridge toward his son. He knows he made mistakes, unforgivable ones. But the longer Gio pushes him away, the more Dante fears he's losing him forever. The irony is brutal. In trying to protect his child from a complex truth, he has shattered any foundation of trust they might have built. Brooklyn is no less devastated. She always told herself the timing would eventually be right. That she'd tell Gio when he was old enough. When he was ready. But that moment never came, and now, it's too late. Dante's pain is compounded by another quiet rupture forming in his life, his other son, Rocco. Once the quiet, steady center of his world, Rocco has begun to pull away. First it was late-night phone calls he didn't explain, then visits to the hospital that didn't align with his school schedule. When Dante confronted him, Rocco didn't yell or storm out. He simply looked his father in the eye and said, "I don't think I belong here anymore." And Dante knew something had shifted. The truth came not long after. Rocco had discovered something life-altering, that Britt Westbourne, long thought to be gone, was not only alive but had a biological link to him that no one had ever explained. Though Lulu Spencer is his mother in every practical sense, it was Britt who had carried him to term. The embryo had been Lulu's, yes, but it was Britt who gave birth to him. Britt who had felt his first movements, who had known his heartbeat before anyone else. Rocco's discovery was accidental. A mention in hospital records during a tour program, but the emotional weight was immediate. And it wasn't just about biology. Rocco had been meeting with Britt secretly. She had reached out to him gently, not to claim motherhood, but to offer answers. She spoke to him not as someone seeking to replace Lulu, but as someone who had always carried a connection she never thought she'd be able to express. That connection, fragile but real, took root. Rocco began spending more time with Britt and Liesel, feeling an unspoken sense of acceptance. It wasn't a rejection of Dante or Lulu, it was the start of something he hadn't even known he was missing. And so when Rocco told Dante he was thinking about moving in with Britt and Liesel, it wasn't out of anger. It was clarity. For Dante, it was a second blow. First Gio, then Rocco, both sons turning away from him. He didn't fight it, not right away. He knew better than to push. But that knowledge didn't make it hurt any less. He stood in his empty apartment one night, the silence unbearable, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. He had built his life around protecting others. His badge, his integrity, his sense of right and wrong, none of it mattered if he couldn't protect his own children from slipping away. But fate wasn't done unraveling the delicate threads of his family. Gio, aimless and brooding, had started spending more time on campus late at night, particularly near the restricted science buildings. It was there he crossed paths with Emma Scorpio Drake. Emma, once the bright-eyed daughter of Port Charles's most revered medical duo, had grown into a passionate, determined young woman who saw justice through a microscope. She had become obsessed with the idea that Professor Henry Dalton's laboratory was conducting illegal experiments on animals, maybe even worse. Rumors had circulated about strange sounds, cages being wheeled in after hours, and locked freezers filled with unmarked vials. Emma had a plan. She had stolen a master key from Vaughn, a careless security supervisor who never noticed when his ID badge went missing. She believed she could enter the lab while Dalton was distracted giving a lecture to the medical students. But Gio, who had slowly been drawn into her orbit, stopped her. He pointed out that her absence from the lecture would be immediately noticed. Dalton always looked for Emma in the front row, and her missing face would raise alarms. So Gio volunteered. He would enter the lab. Alone. He didn't do it to impress Emma, though her fierce conviction had certainly stirred something in him. He did it because he needed something to believe in, something other than the tangled family drama that had taken over his life. If he could expose something real, something wrong, maybe he could prove he was more than the product of a lie. The night of the lecture came. Emma sat in the lecture hall, her eyes trained on Dalton but her mind on the building across campus. Meanwhile, Gio used the master key to slip into the lab. He moved quietly, carefully avoiding motion sensors and bypassing cameras with the help of a device Emma had secured from a friend in IT. For a few moments, everything went smoothly. He photographed documents, snapped images of unmarked substances, and even found what looked like a list of trial subjects, none of them animals. But then he made a mistake. In his haste, Gio bumped into a backup alarm trigger under a desk. The lab lit up in red. Sirens screamed. He bolted, but by the time he reached the side door, campus security was already on site. And so was Dante. It was a cruel twist of timing. Dante had been tipped off by the department that suspicious activity had been reported at the university science wing. When he arrived and saw his own son in handcuffs, it was like the final blow. The officers deferred to him, but protocol demanded an arrest. Dante, stone-faced and professional, read his son his rights and placed him in the back of the patrol car. Gio didn't say a word, not until they reached the station. That's when the shouting started. Gio accused Dante of never being a father, of being more loyal to the badge than to his own blood. He called him a traitor, a liar, a coward. Dante took it all. He didn't try to defend himself. He followed procedure, even as Brooke Lynn stormed in, demanding to know how he could bring their son in like a criminal. Brooke Lynn was livid. She had tried to maintain peace, tried to support Dante through the fallout of the paternity reveal, but this was too much. Seeing Gio behind bars, even for a night, broke something in her. She didn't care about procedure or the law. She cared about her son. And right now, he felt betrayed by both parents. Dante was left standing in the middle, watching everything he loved fracture in real time. And as Gio sat alone in the holding cell, staring at the wall, he made a quiet vow to never trust Dante again. Whatever biological bond they shared had been severed by cold steel and a pair of handcuffs. And no apology would undo it. At the Quartermain estate, Brooke Lynn sat in a quiet room, the weight of recent events pressing on her like a stone against her chest. She had tried to shield Gio for years, tried to control the narrative of his life by keeping the truth from him. But now, everything had unraveled. She had watched as Gio, her son, stood behind a pane of glass in a holding cell, his face blank and unreadable. The boy who once held her hand when crossing the street now looked at her like a stranger. She knew the damage wasn't just from Dante's arrest, it was decades of silence catching up with them all at once. But Brooke Lynn also knew that silence no longer served anyone. She began combing through old journals, messages, and encrypted files. Anything she had stored or kept over the years that might help make sense of what came next. She wasn't just looking for ways to reach Gio. She was beginning to suspect the truth they had buried was part of something larger. Lisa Labrecht's name came up too many times. Mentions of research, of secrets passed among elite medical professionals. Connections that never quite made sense. And it all seemed to orbit around one person, Britt Westbourne. Britt, meanwhile, was quietly building a case of her own. After her reunion with Jason in Croatia, she had returned to Port Charles under heavy disguise, careful not to reveal herself until the moment was right. Only a handful of people knew she was alive: Jason, Rocco, and now Brooke Lynn, whom she had contacted anonymously. Britt had begun collecting evidence about the decades-long conspiracy that surrounded her origins. It wasn't just about being stolen from Nina. It wasn't even just about Lisa lying to her for years. It was the intricate web of manipulation and power that had touched nearly every major family in the town. She had tracked down old medical logs hidden under pseudonyms, records falsified under Liesel's authority, and even transcripts that suggested that her own illness had been a fabrication. Britt had believed for years that her condition was terminal. Liesel had cried with her, held her through treatments. Now she knew it had all been part of a ploy, perhaps to keep her compliant, perhaps to control her, or maybe even to keep her from discovering who she really was. Britt wasn't just motivated by revenge. She wanted justice. She wanted clarity. And she wanted Rocco safe. Their connection had deepened rapidly. The moment he learned she was alive, something shifted in him. It wasn't simply a matter of biology. Rocco saw in Britt a woman who had been cast aside and lied to, much like himself. And Britt, for all her mistakes, had no interest in controlling him. She listened. She asked questions. She told the truth. The bond between them wasn't built on years of proximity, it was built on raw honesty, something Rocco had not felt with Dante in a long time. Rocco had been spending nights at Britt's apartment, away from the familiar noise of the Spencer Falconeri home. He spoke with Liesel cautiously but had learned to keep a safe emotional distance. He suspected there was more she hadn't told him, and Britt quietly confirmed it. Together, they began compiling their own timeline of events. Who knew what and when? Who had signed the consent forms? Who had access to embryo transport protocols? Who was present when Lulu was declared unable to carry her own child? Britt admitted to Rocco that she had originally taken the embryo under pressure from Liesel and other unknown collaborators. At the time, she was young and eager to please, hungry for medical achievement and acceptance. But she had come to love the unborn child she carried. The guilt of stealing that chance from Lulu weighed on her, but she had never stopped believing that Rocco deserved the full truth of his life. It was a complicated truth, but it was his. Meanwhile, Dante's relationship with the department had begun to suffer. The arrest of his own son had become a public spectacle, and many officers began to question his judgment. He wasn't suspended, but whispers of forced leave surfaced. He tried to brush them off. Instead, he focused on surveillance footage from Dalton's lab. He watched Gio sneak in, saw the moment the alarm triggered. But what disturbed him more was something deeper in the footage. Not just Joe's actions, but Dalton's reaction afterward. Dalton had gone to extreme lengths to cover something up. Within 10 minutes of Joe's arrest, the professor had ordered an entire sterilization of the lab, security footage beyond the last 12 hours was erased, and several crates marked Project N had been moved to an unknown location. When Dante tried to subpoena the contents, he was denied access. The order had come from above, someone with more power than a local officer could challenge. But he wasn't about to let it go. Emma, devastated that Gio had taken the fall for her plan, came to visit him in juvenile holding. She apologized, again and again, but Gio barely spoke. He wasn't angry at her, he was angry at the whole system that allowed such secrets to exist. When he finally did speak, it was to ask one question: do you still believe they're testing on people in that lab? Emma hesitated, then nodded. I'm starting to think they're not just testing. I think they're creating something. With that, a plan began to take shape. Brooke Lynn contacted Britt. Britt reached out to Jason. And Emma reached out to Anna Devane, hoping to quietly loop in the one person with enough ties to both WSB and the local government to investigate discreetly. It became clear that what had started as personal betrayals had grown into something far more sinister. As Brooke Lynn dove deeper into the encrypted files she had recovered from the Courtemain archives, many of which were stored by her grandfather for unknown reasons, she uncovered a connection between Liesel and a decades-old program once known as Operation Aeon. It involved genetic sequencing, surrogacy, and population control. Names like Nina Reeves and Britt Westbourne were listed as subjects. Not participants, subjects. And the sponsor of the operation? An organization called Evergent, which now quietly funded research at the university where Dalton worked. The deeper Brooke Lynn looked, the more terrified she became. Gio hadn't just broken into a lab. He had crossed a line into a war that had been brewing for decades. And his arrest might have put him in more danger than anyone realized. Back at the station, Gio was released under Brooke Lynn's custody, thanks to a technicality in the arrest procedure. But the tension remained. He wouldn't speak to Dante. Wouldn't look him in the eye. When Brooke Lynn told him what she had discovered, Joe's first instinct was to act. He wanted to go back into the lab. Find the files. Track down Dalton. But Brooke Lynn stopped him. Not yet, she said. We need evidence. We need to take this apart the right way. But the right way would never be enough. Because within days, Dalton disappeared. He didn't resign. He didn't transfer. His apartment was cleared out. His phone disconnected. All that remained was a single piece of evidence, an ID badge dropped near the docks where Britt had once hidden after her staged death. Britt, alarmed by the escalation, realized it was time to reveal herself. She met with Jason in a secure location, and they planned a public return. She wouldn't hide anymore. She would go to the media if necessary. The town had to know what was happening. Liesel, sensing the noose tightening around her secrets, made a move of her own. She visited Rocco late at night, asking for a final chance to explain everything. She brought with her an old photo album, filled with images of Britt growing up, moments frozen in time that had been hidden for decades. She spoke of regret, of love, of twisted logic used to justify her crimes. But she also spoke of fear. Not for herself, but for Britt. For Rocco. You don't understand who they are, she said. The people I worked with, they don't forgive. They don't forget. And now that Britt is speaking out, she's marked. Rocco, confused and shaken, went to Britt. When he told her what Liesel had said, Britt nodded solemnly. I've known for a long time, she said. But I'm done running. The storm had been gathering. Now it was ready to break. And in the quiet heart of Port Charles, secrets decades in the making were finally being dragged into the light.